When the first alien ultimatum arrived over Earth, it came wrapped in polite contempt and absolute certainty. A transmission translated into every human language that informed the governments of the planet that resistance was unnecessary, and surrender would be rewarded with mercy. And across the council chambers of the invading Concordat, there was laughter at the thought that these short-lived mammals with divided nations and outdated fleets could possibly do anything else, because the Concordat had crushed 100 worlds before breakfast and had learned to recognize fear when it saw it. Yet on Earth the reaction was not panic, but quiet and dangerous calm, as leaders who had argued for decades suddenly found agreement in the knowledge that begging never saved anyone. And while the public broadcast showed diplomats requesting time and speaking of peace, the secure rooms beneath mountains and oceans filled with officers like Admiral John Carter and Director Helen Brooks, who had spent their lives planning for a day they hoped would never come, a day when humanity would be forced to decide what kind of species it truly was. And as alien envoys watched human representatives bow their heads and speak of cooperation, they mistook restraint for weakness, unaware that the words were chosen carefully to buy hours, not mercy, because within those hours sleeper fleets powered up beyond Pluto. Factories that had never officially existed began producing munitions at rates the Concordat believed impossible, and old treaties between rival human blocs were suspended with a single sentence that said survival came first. While light years away aboard the Concordat flagship, an alien commander named Vesh Tal watched reports of human compliance within amusement and told his subordinates that the species would fold once shown a single demonstration of force. So he ordered a punitive strike on a minor orbital station to remind Earth of its place. And when that station vanished in A, brief flash humanity mourned quietly and finished its preparations, because the dead were already being counted into price of revenge. And when the Concordat fleet finally crossed a boundary into human-controlled space, expecting pleas and chaos, they instead found silence, a silence broken only when long-range sensors began to fail in patterns no alien doctrine recognized, followed by the sudden appearance of human vessels that did not match any known design and did not transmit demands or threats. And as the first alien ships died, without understanding why the realization spread too late to the Concordat command that humans had never intended to beg at all, they had intended to endure, to adapt, and then to choose revenge with the cold patience of a species that had survived its own worst enemies for centuries. And as alarms echoed and stars seemed to shift around them, the aliens finally understood that mercy was never something humanity planned to ask for. It was something they would decide whether or not to give. The shock that rippled through the Concordat fleet in the minutes after the first human strike did not come from the loss of ships alone, but from the collapse of certainty, because their entire doctrine was built on the belief that lesser species broke quickly once dominance was displayed. Yet as burning debris drifted in emergency channels filled with overlapping commands, Vesh Tal realized that no clear picture of the battlefield existed anymore. Human vessels appeared and vanished without predictable vectors. Their weapons struck from distances the Concordat had never considered tactically relevant. And worst of all, the humans did not pursue fleeing targets in chaotic bloodlust, but withdrew with disciplined precision, as if the opening exchange had only been a test. While back on Earth, public channels finally showed something other than pleading speeches, as Director Helen Brooks addressed the planet in a calm voice that did not promise safety or victory, but told the truth that humanity had been attacked and that the response would be unified and deliberate. A message echoed by leaders who days earlier could not agree on trade tariffs, yet now spoke with one intent. And across shipyards hidden in asteroid belts and beneath planetary crust, crews who had trained in secrecy received activation codes they had memorized years ago, codes that meant the rules no longer applied. And as fleets assembled, Admiral John Carter stood on the bridge of a command carrier watching sensor feeds that confirmed what planners had hoped but never proven, that the Concordat relied on centralized command structures and predictable supply lines, vulnerabilities humans understood intimately from their own violent history. So instead of meeting the alien armada head-on, Carter ordered strikes against relay nodes and logistics hubs far from the front, knowing that a blade to the spine was deadlier than a punch to the face. And when those hubs began to fail, the Concordat commanders accused each other of incompetence. Unable to accept that a species they had labeled primitive had mapped their networks years earlier using unmanned probes dismissed as debris. And in Concordat capital, world panic began to surface as reports contradicted propaganda. While alien civilians who had been told the war was already won now saw rationing begin and communications falter, And through it all, humanity remained silent on open channels, refusing to broadcast threats or demands, because the goal was not to frighten the enemy into submission, but to teach them understanding. And that understanding came slowly and painfully as Concordat forces attempted to regroup, only to find human resistance everywhere and nowhere at once. A war without a single decisive battle, but filled with losses that accumulated like a debt that could never be paid. And as Vesh Tal stared at a tactical display that no longer made sense, he finally spoke the thought none of his kind had ever admitted aloud, that perhaps the mistake was not underestimating human weapons, but misunderstanding human intent. Because this was not a war for territory or prestige. It was a lesson written in fire meant to ensure that no one would ever again expect humanity to beg. As the weeks stretched into a grinding campaign, the Concordat learned that human revenge was not explosive rage, but sustained pressure applied with ruthless logic. Because every time an alien commander thought they had identified a pattern, the humans changed it, sometimes striking hard, sometimes withdrawing entirely to let confusion fester. And this uncertainty eroded morale faster than losses ever could, while within human command circles, Admiral John Carter and his planners reviewed after action reports with a grim professionalism that left no room for celebration, noting where alien defenses adapted and where fear caused overreaction, adjusting strategies the way surgeons adjusted techniques. And far from the front director, Helen Brooks coordinated diplomatic messages that were never sent to Concordat, but quietly delivered to neutral civilizations. Messages that did not ask for help, but simply documented alien aggression and human response with careful evidence, planting doubt in the wider galaxy about the narrative of human weakness. And those seeds began to grow as traders and observers reported that Concordat fleets no longer moved with confidence, and that entire systems were being abandoned not because they were lost, but because supply lines could no longer be trusted. While aboard a battered Concordat cruiser, a junior officer named Kesh Rao listened to senior commanders argue about whether to escalate or withdraw, arguments that would once have been unthinkable because the Concordat did not retreat from those considered inferior. Yet now every option seemed worse than the last. Escalation risk provoking weapons of humans clearly had not fully revealed, and withdrawal threatened political collapse at home. And in that paralysis, humanity struck again not with annihilation, but with exposure as human intelligence teams leaked recordings of Concordat, leaders discussing the planned subjugation of Earth to the wider galactic net, recordings that spread faster than Concordat sensors could suppress them, turning former allies cold and emboldening subject species who began to resist quietly. And as unrest simmered across Concordat space, Vesh Tal finally understood that the humans were fighting on a level the Concordat had never prepared for, where battles were only one front among many and victory was measured in long-term stability rather than immediate conquest. And when he requested permission to open negotiations, the response from the capital was delayed by hours due to damaged relays, a delay that cost thousands more ships as human forces dismantled another critical junction. And in those burning hours, the truth settled in across alien ranks that the choice humanity had made was irreversible. They had chosen revenge not as a moment of anger, but as a policy, and policies once enacted could not be undone by apologies or late-born respect. By the time the Concordat attempted to reorganize its forces, the shape of the war had already been decided, because humanity had removed the enemy's ability to choose where and how to fight, and across human-controlled space life, continued with a strange mixture of normal routine and quiet mobilization as civilians adapted to rationing and blackout drills, with a discipline born from shared understanding rather than fear, while factories ran without pause and crews rotated through long shifts, knowing exactly why their exhaustion mattered. And in the depths of a mobile command station, Admiral John Carter met with analysts who presented projections showing that the Concordat could no longer sustain its losses without turning inward, fracturing along political lines that had been invisible before the war. And Carter approved the next phase not as a strike plan, but as a restraint plan, ordering human fleets to limit civilian casualties, even when targets were tempting, because the objective was not extermination but correction, a concept that confused many alien observers who expected vengeance to mean slaughter. Yet this restraint became another weapon as neutral worlds began to compare human conduct with Concordat history and drew conclusions that could not be undone. While director Helen Brooks received reports of secret communications from minor alien states offering intelligence and trade access not out of loyalty, but out of calculation that humanity was becoming the safer bet, and those offers were accepted quietly without triumph, because the lesson humanity intended to teach required patience, and within the Concordat hierarchy, panic hardened into desperation, as leaders authorized the deployment of an ancient weapon system meant to cow entire regions into submission, a decision made without consensus and driven by the belief that terror would restore obedience. But when the weapon activated, it failed catastrophically under conditions the Concordat had never tested. Conditions the humans had engineered through subtle interference weeks earlier, and the resulting disaster destroyed not a human world, but Concordat shipyard, killing tens of thousands of alien workers and igniting outrage across their own population. And in the aftermath, Vesh Tal watched as senior officers were arrested by their own security forces, accused of betraying Concordat through incompetence. And it was in that moment that the final illusion collapsed, the illusion that this war was something happening far away, because now the consequences had come home, and as riots spread and communication networks fractured, Vesh Tal sent a message directly to human command, not with demands, but with a statement of reality that the Concordat no longer had control over its own destiny. And the human response was not immediate retaliation or gloating silence, but a simple acknowledgement that negotiations could be discussed when Concordat forces fully withdrew from human space, a condition that felt humiliating to aliens who had never withdrawn from anything. Yet as ships turned back and borders stabilized, the galaxy watched and learned that humanity's revenge was not loud or theatrical but structural, aimed at ensuring that the thought of forcing humans to beg would never again seem like a reasonable plan. In the uneasy quiet that followed the Concordat withdrawal, humanity did not relax its posture, because revenge chosen as policy required follow-through, and across human command networks, analysts tracked every alien movement with a patience that contrasted sharply with the panic still unfolding inside Concordat space, where provisional councils argued about blame and survival, while entire sectors demanded autonomy. And Vesh Tal, now stripped of ceremonial authority, but still respected for his honesty, was summoned to advise leaders who no longer trusted their own doctrines, advising them that the humans were not preparing an invasion but a boundary, a line beyond which behavior would have consequences. And this concept terrified Concordat elites more than total war, because it meant constant accountability. While on Earth, Admiral John Carter addressed a closed assembly of civilian leaders, explaining that the objective had shifted from winning battles to shaping memory, ensuring that every decision humanity made reinforced a lesson already written into alien infrastructure and politics, and Director Helen Brooks coordinated the release of carefully selected information to the Galactic Commons, showing humanitarian aid offered to former Concordat subject worlds, aid delivered without conditions and without demands for allegiance, which forced those worlds to reevaluate everything they had been told about humans as brutal avengers. And as trade routes reopened under human, escort alien merchants began to speak openly about the contrast between Concordat rule and human conduct, conversations that spread faster than any fleet, while within the Concordat military remnants, officers like Vesh Tal were tasked with rebuilding forces under strict civilian oversight, an arrangement that felt alien and humiliating yet necessary after collapse of trust. And during one tense exchange, Vesh Tal admitted to his peers that the humans had not broken the Concordat with superior firepower alone, but by exposing how brittle their unity had been all along, a truth that could not be unlearned. And as months passed without further human strikes, some alien leaders dared to hope that revenge had run its course. Yet Carter warned his counterparts that restraint should never be mistaken for forgiveness, and that the absence of violence was itself conditional. And when a rogue Concordat faction attempted to raid a neutral system under the old banner, human response was immediate and precise, disabling ships without loss of life and broadcasting to captured crews being treated according to strict legal standards, a message that resonated far deeper than annihilation ever could. And in that moment across the galaxy, a new understanding settled in that humanity had not chosen revenge to satisfy anger, but to redefine power, demonstrating that mercy asked for was weakness, but mercy granted from a position of strength was authority. And the memory of that choice began to shape decisions far beyond the war's end. As the new balance settled into place, the galaxy adjusted around humanity, like a structure reinforcing itself after an earthquake, because every major power now calculated human response as a fixed constant rather than an unknown variable. And this predictability made humanity more dangerous than any rumor ever had. While on Earth, Admiral John Carter gradually withdrew fleets from forward positions not as a sign of fatigue, but as proof that dominance did not require constant display. And Director Helen Brooks shifted focus from wartime coordination to long-term frameworks that embedded human presence into trade, arbitration, and security agreements across multiple regions, ensuring that any future conflict would intersect with human interests before it reached violence. And within Concordat space, the process of reform moved unevenly as old elites resisted and younger leaders pushed for transparency, a struggle that sometimes erupted into brief clashes quickly contained by their own restructured forces trained now with human advisors who emphasize discipline and accountability rather than spectacle. And Vesh Tal found himself attending strategy sessions where the primary question was no longer how to defeat enemies, but how to avoid provoking humanity, a profound shift that altered military culture at its core, while Vesh Tal, aging and weary, recorded a final address to the Concordat archives, stating plainly that their greatest failure had been assuming mercy, was a resource to be extracted through intimidation rather than a choice granted by strength, a recording that spread beyond Concordat borders and was studied quietly by other species. And as years passed without major conflict, children on distant worlds learned about the war not as a tale of human savagery, but as a case study in consequences. And when minor powers tested boundaries elsewhere in the galaxy, they did so cautiously, often seeking human mediation before acting, because the memory of silent human fleets appearing without warning had not faded, and humanity itself changed in subtle ways as veterans returned to civilian life, carrying the knowledge that unity was possible when survival demanded it, a knowledge that reshaped politics and culture long after the last shots were fired. And in this new era, no empire spoke openly of making humans beg again, because revenge had taught the galaxy a lesson deeper than fear, that humanity did not seek domination but would not tolerate subjugation, and that choosing to test that boundary was not an act of bravery, but a decision to repeat a mistake history had already judged and condemned. Time moved forward, and what remained of the Concordat conflict settled into history, yet the consequences continued to unfold in ways that no single treaty could contain, because revenge chosen by humanity had reshaped expectations rather than borders, and across newly stabilized regions, mixed human and alien task groups responded to piracy, famine, and border disputes with an efficiency that quietly replaced the old image of human unpredictability with one of measured inevitability, while Admiral John Carter, now older and rarely seen in public, served as a strategic advisor whose words carried weight precisely because he spoke rarely, reminding councils that peace was not a natural state, but maintained condition, and Director Helen Brooks oversaw the transition of emergency wartime authorities into permanent interstellar institutions designed to outlast individual leaders, institutions that recorded decisions transparently so that future generations would understand not only what had been done but why. And within Concordat society, the reforms that once seemed impossible slowly took root as former subject worlds gained representation, and oversight mechanisms limited the concentration of power that had led to disaster. And Vesh Tal rose to restructure military not as a hero, but as a professional shaped by failure, teaching cadets that the most dangerous enemy was certainty untested by doubt, a lesson drawn directly from watching humans dismantle an empire without ever declaring total war. And beyond Concordat borders, other civilizations adjusted their doctrines, investing less in grand armadas meant to intimidate and more in resilience, diplomacy, and intelligence, because the human example had proven that raw force without understanding only accelerated collapse, and humanity itself resisted the temptation to mythologize the war as a simple victory, with educators and leaders emphasizing the cost paid in lives and trust, ensuring that remembrance did not turn into arrogance. And when fringe voices called for expansion or dominance, they were countered not by censorship, but by evidence of how quickly unity forged by necessity could fracture if misused. And in quiet moments, Carter reflected that the most important outcome of choosing revenge was not the fear it inspired, but the restraint it demanded afterward, because power once demonstrated could not be taken back, only managed responsibly. And as the galaxy continued to evolve around this new constant, the underlying truth endured that humans had not won because they were crueler or stronger alone, but because they had understood something Concordat never had. That mercy begged for submission. But mercy chosen after strength was proven became a language the entire galaxy could understand and respect. In the final accounting of the conflict, the galaxy came to understand that the war had ended not with a surrender ceremony or a burned capital, but with recalibration of assumptions, because humanity had demonstrated that survival did not require constant aggression, and that revenge, once chosen, could be wielded with discipline rather than chaos. And as decades passed, a memory of the Concordat ultimatum became a quiet reference point invoked whenever a rising power considered testing human resolve, a reminder that the species which had once been dismissed as fractured and primitive had proven capable of unity, patience, and strategic depth unmatched by empires far older, while on Earth a generation that had lived through the crisis aged into leadership roles carrying the lived knowledge that begging for mercy was never the path to safety, and that choosing when and how to extend mercy mattered more than demanding it. And in Concordat space, the rebuilt society endured with humility, its leaders keenly aware that their continued existence depended on respecting boundaries they had once ignored. And when Vesh Tal finally passed into history, his recorded words remained required study not as a confession of defeat, but as a warning against certainty unchallenged. And Kesh Rao, now nearing the end of the service, watched new cadets debate ethics and restraint with a seriousness that would have been mocked before the war. And beyond them, all the broader galaxy settled into a cautious but functional order where disputes were argued before they were fought, and where the idea of forcing a species to its knees had lost its appeal, because humanity's choice of revenge had rewritten the cost of arrogance. And in that quiet, enduring lesson, the true legacy of the war remained, not the ships destroyed or the systems lost, but the understanding shared across countless worlds that humans would never beg for mercy, and that provoking them meant inviting consequences, delivered with calm resolve that left no room for misunderstanding.